I can pull a glowing piece of glass out of my pocket and learn how to rebuild a transmission, speak conversational Spanish, or understand the history of the Roman Empire. That's how easy it is to access information and learning today. We live in an era of open source software, Wikipedia, and public libraries, and we tend to treat the democratization of knowledge like it's a modern invention. The truth is, for the vast majority of human history, deciding who gets to know things was the ultimate form of power. Knowledge wasn't just expensive, it was a closely guarded asset. If you wanted to study history, government administration, or philosophy, you had to be born into the right bloodline. The ruling class stayed in charge by hoarding information and making sure the common people were permanently locked out. Knowledge was a walled garden, and society was obsessed with guarding the gate. It's a revolutionary idea today to say that everyone, regardless of their background, deserves access to a high-quality education. But imagine how radical it was 2.5 millennia ago. In 6th century BCE China, education was strictly an aristocratic privilege. But Confucius looked at the political fragmentation and corruption of his era and realized that gatekeeping knowledge wasn't going to save the world. To build a better society, you couldn't just teach the sons of dukes and lords. You had to democratize the information. He looked at that elite, walled garden of education, and he decided to tear down the gates. Exploring the Analects Episode 2, Passage 15.39, Teachers Aren't Gatekeepers. Hey folks, this is Elliot Bernstein. Thanks for joining me for the second episode of Exploring the Analects. Today, we'll be talking about Passage 15.39 of the Analects, another 4-character phrase, in which Confucius explains what it means to be a great teacher. Since this is only the second episode, I'll start with another quick overview of the series and its format. I'll be working through the hundreds of passages in the Analects, a collection of quotes attributed to Confucius and compiled by followers of the Confucian Way in China between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE. These passages touch on a whole range of topics that can still teach us how to live our lives today. They range in length from just a few syllables to several paragraphs of texts. We're starting with some of the shortest, and we'll work through to longer passages, but we may start to jump around once things are on a roll. Each episode, I'll start off with an introduction to the quote. I'll give my take on it, read the Chinese, and then give a more formal translation. Next, we'll talk about the philosophy, history, and culture behind the quote. After that, I'll give linguistic notes, hopefully something that could be of use to language learners at any level. Finally, I'll wrap up with comments on the passage's place in the Analects and mention any varying interpretations that might have not made it in elsewhere. Now that that's covered, let's jump in and take a look at the quote. I'll start off with my own little spin on passage 15.39. This isn't meant to be authoritative by any means, but the idea is that the modern phrasing and subject matter might give you something to hang your hat on as we dive deeper into the subject. And here it is. Teachers aren't gatekeepers. Confucius was an incredibly opinionated man when it came to how to teach. As much as he wished to bring harmony and balance to the chaotic world of 6th century BCE China, he was clear-eyed about the fact that it was unlikely to happen in his lifetime. It would have to happen through the efforts of successive generations of his disciples. So, not being a gatekeeper was of practical concern to Confucius, and as we'll see, his students came from all walks of life. Next up, I'll read the quote in a modern manner in pronunciation. Then we'll follow up with a more faithful translation into English by Professor Peimin Ni in his book, Understanding the Analects of Confucius. 子曰, 有教无类. The master said, in offering instruction, there is no classification. This is a statement about how to properly conduct education. Don't classify. Most commentaries on the passage focus on who is being educated, as I've done above by saying teachers aren't gatekeepers. And there's no doubt that Confucius had students' backgrounds in mind when he wrote this. But this passage is just 4 characters long, so it goes without saying there's a whole lot of room for interpretation. Now that we're done introducing the passage and discussing its basic meaning, let's dive in a bit deeper and discuss what some of those interpretations are. This section might appeal to you if you're interested in the philosophical, historical, or cultural context behind the passage. Following that, I'll talk a bit about the language. Ask almost anyone who Confucius was, and they'll tell you he was a philosopher. Some might remember a quote or two and say he focused on politics, or that he stressed the importance of family relationships. And although these are true, he was first and foremost a teacher. In fact, even today, for many Chinese people, Confucius was and always will be history's supreme model of an educator, a sort of patron saint of all things education. In this respect, the Analects also speaks for itself. The character jiāo, to teach, appears 7 times. Hui, to instruct, 8 times. Xue, to learn, appears 65 times. Zhi, to know, knowledge or wisdom, 117 times. And references to his students are made somewhere in the ballpark of over 500 times. So was Confucius a good teacher? Yeah, he was. He didn't even write the Analects. His students did. Doing such a good job that your students can write a book on the subject you teach? Well, I personally can't imagine a better endorsement of a teacher. The Analects contains numerous passages detailing Confucius's pedagogical philosophy, and this is the shortest of them all. Let's dig into it a bit. According to this passage, teaching should be done without classification, or wu lei. Professor Peimin Ni, who wrote the translation I quoted above, points out that Confucius's students were about as varied of a bunch as you'd find in ancient China. They came from beggar families and the political elite. Some were businessmen and others were government officials. Some were nearly the same age as him, and others were 50 years younger. In a few cases, he even taught multiple generations of the same family. I'll sum this up with references to a few more passages that you might want to read if you're interested in Confucius's egalitarian take on education. 16.4 mentions Tentai Mianwang, who Confucius at first dismissed due to his rough appearance, but later accepted as a student and found to be truly excellent, showing that even in old age, Confucius was trying to get better at not judging a book by its cover. 7.7 is Confucius's famous statement that he'd accept any student who could give him so little as a bundle of dried meat. In a time when education was the privilege of the elite, this was a radical departure, showing that he really did offer instruction without classification. Next, let's discuss the language in this passage. If you're studying Chinese, one of the first characters you'll encounter is you, to have, but you might still not have come across wu, to be absent of something. Fortunately, you probably have already learned meyo, to not have, right when you learned yo. So this isn't going to be too much of a stretch. Wu is just a single character and somewhat literary way of saying 没有, or to not have. Mei means something completely different in ancient Chinese. It's a modern linguistic construct as part of 没有. So there are many other ways to express negation or absence found throughout the Analects, and Wu is one of the more important ones. With a different phrasing, you might see another one of these negatives like bu or mo, but because yo is right there at the start, Wu is used later as its natural grammatical pair. Jiāo, to teach, is another one that you're likely to have come across in early to intermediate study. Jiāo ke, to teach class. Jiāo shi, instructor. Jiāo shou, professor. These are all common Chinese words. An interesting note about jiāo is that it can be either first or fourth tone. Now, I'm not a master of tones by any means, and I'm sure any native speaker can hear that, but I'll do my best to explain it. Jiāo should be first tone if it's used as a verb, and fourth tone if it's used as a noun. When spoken alone, since it will usually be a verb, you'll just hear it in the first tone, jiāo. The verb phrase jiāo ke, to teach class, is also first tone. Jiāo shi, an instructor, and jiāo shou, professor, on the other hand, are nouns, so you'll hear those in the falling fourth tone. A fun etymological note about jiāo is that it contains the character xiao, or filial piety. So if you weren't sure whether or not education is what's needed to make a kid behave, now at least you know what the opinion of the ancient Chinese was. Finally, let's talk about lei, another character that's important if you're working on your modern Chinese. This one can be used on its own, even in modern Chinese. Like if you want to refer to a type of people, you can say 这类人, but it's also part of compound words like 类型, type, and 人类, humankind. Last up, I want to talk about varied interpretations of this passage. We already thoroughly covered the fact that Confucius accepted all sorts of students, but 不类 is so general that it would be silly not to consider that he might have had other things in mind than just people. The subject matter Confucius taught and the way in which he encouraged his students to learn was intentionally broad. In 6.27, he explains that the junzi, or exemplary person, who is broadly learned in culture, is not likely to go astray. And the character that he uses to mean broad here, bo, is later used in the academic title, 博士, or literally, a broadly learned scholar. Students of Chinese language will note that in modern Chinese, this is also the term for a PhD. 7.6 and 7.25 show just how broad these teachings could get. In addition to the 6 arts of ritual, music, archery, charioteering, writing, and arithmetic, Confucius encouraged his students to learn culture, conduct, be human-hearted, and even wander in the arts. The order in which one was to study these is never specified in the Analects, and there's been much debate over what order to study them in throughout the centuries among Confucian scholars, but we'll leave that for another time. This is your host, Elliot Bernstein. I hope you've enjoyed this second episode of Exploring the Analects. Next, we'll read 10.12, graduating from 4 characters to 5 characters in a passage focused on exactly how people sat during Confucius's time, since chairs hadn't been invented yet. See you there.